Lessons 825. In a number of sections of this report, the inquiry has set out explicit lessons. They relate in particular to those elements of the UK's engagement in Iraq which might be replicated in future operations. 826. The decision to join the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 was the product of a particular set of circumstances which are unlikely to be repeated. Unlike other instances in which military force has been used, the invasion was not prompted by the aggression of another country or an unfolding humanitarian disaster. The lessons drawn by the inquiry on the pre-conflict element of this report are therefore largely context-specific and embedded in its conclusions. Lessons on the collective ministerial decision-making, where the principles identified are enduring ones, are an exception. They and the other lessons which have general application are set out below. The decision to go to war. 827. In a democratic system, public support and understanding for a major military operation are essential. It is therefore important to guard against overstating what military action might achieve and against any tendency to play down the risks. A realistic assessment of the possibilities and limitations of armed force and of the challenges of intervening in the affairs of other states should help any future UK government manage expectations, including its own. 827. When the potential for military action arises, the government should not commit to a firm political objective before it's clear that it can be achieved. Regular reassessment is essential to ensure that the assumptions upon which policy is being made and implemented remain correct. 829. Once an issue becomes a matter for the Security Council, the UK government cannot expect to retain control of how it is to be discussed and eventually decided, unless it is able to work with the interests and agendas of other member states. In relation to Iraq, the independent role of the inspectors was a further dimension. 830. A military timetable should not be allowed to dictate a diplomatic timetable. If a strategy of coercive diplomacy is being pursued, forces should be deployed in such a way that the threat of action can be increased or decreased according to the diplomatic situation, and the policy can be sustained for as long as necessary. 831. The issue of influencing the US, both at the strategic and at the operational level, was a constant preoccupation at all levels of the UK government. 832. Prime Ministers will always wish to exercise their own political judgment on how to handle the relationship with the US. It will depend on personal relationships as well as on the nature of the issues being addressed. On all these matters of strategy and diplomacy, the inquiry recognises that there is no standard formula that will be appropriate in all cases. 833. Whether or not influence has been exercised can be difficult to ascertain, even in retrospect. The views of allies are most likely to make a difference when they come in one side of an internal debate, and there are a number of instances where the UK arguments did make a difference to the formation and implementation of US policy. The US and UK are close allies, but the relationship between the two is unequal. 834. The exercise of influence will always involve a combination of identifying the prerequisites for success in a shared endeavour and a degree of bargaining to make sure that the approach meets the national interest. In situations like the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, if certain measures are identified as prerequisite for success, then their importance should be underlined from the start. There are no prizes for sharing a failure. Those measures that are most important should be pursued persistently and consistently. If it is assumed that a consequence of making a contribution in one area is that a further contribution would be required in another, then that should be made explicit. Influence should not be set as an objective in itself. The exercise of influence is a means to an end. Weapons of mass destruction. 835. There will continue to be demands for factual evidence to explain the background to controversial policy decisions, including, where appropriate, the explicit and public use of assessed intelligence. 836. The inquiry shares the Butler Review's conclusions that it was a mistake not to see the risk of combining, in the September dossier, the JIC's assessment of intelligence and other evidence with the interpretation and presentation of the evidence in order to make the case for policy action. 837. The nature of the two functions is fundamentally different. As can be seen from the JIC assessments quoted in and published with this report, they contain careful language intended to ensure that no more weight is put on the evidence than it can bear. Organising the evidence in order to present an argument in the language of ministerial statements produces a quite different type of document. 838. The widespread perception that the September 2002 dossier overstated the firmness of the evidence about Iraq's capabilities and intentions in order to influence opinion and make the case for action to disarm Iraq has produced a damaging legacy, including undermining trust and confidence in government statements, particularly those which rely on intelligence which cannot be independently verified. 839. As a result, in situations where the policy response may involve military action, and the evidence, at least in part, depends on inferential judgments drawn from necessarily incomplete intelligence, it may be more difficult to secure support for the government's position and agreement to action. 840. The explicit and public use of material from JIC assessments to underpin policy decisions will be infrequent. But from the evidence on the compilation of the September dossier, the lessons for any similar exercise in future would be the need for clear separation of the responsibility for analysis and assessment of intelligence from the responsibility for making the argument for a policy, the importance of precision in describing the position. In the case of the September dossier, for instance, the term program was used to describe disparate activities at very different stages of maturity. There was a program to extend the range of the Al-Samud missile. There was no program in any meaningful sense to develop and produce nuclear weapons. Use of the shorthand CW or BW in relation to Iraq's capability obscured whether the reference was to weapons or warfare. Constant use of the term weapons of mass destruction without further clarification obscured the differences between the potential impact of nuclear, biological and chemical weapons and the ability to deliver them effectively. For example, there would be a considerable difference between the effects of an artillery shell filled with mustard gas, which is a battlefield weapon, and a long-range ballistic missile with a chemical or biological warhead, which is a weapon of terror. The need to identify and accurately describe the confidence and robustness of the evidence base. There may be evidence which is authoritative, and which puts the issue beyond doubt, but there are likely to be many circumstances when those descriptions could properly be applied to inferential judgments relying on intelligence. The need to be explicit about the likelihood of events. The possibility of Iraq producing and using an improvised nuclear device was, rightly, omitted from the dossier. But the claim that Iraq could build a nuclear weapon within 1 or 2 years if it obtained fissile material and other essential components from foreign sources was included without addressing how feasible and likely that would be. In addition, the executive summary gave prominence to the International Institute of Strategic Studies' suggestion that Iraq would be able to assemble nuclear weapons within months if it could obtain the fissile material, without reference to the material in the main text of the dossier, which made clear that the UK took a very different view. The need to be scrupulous in discriminating between facts and knowledge on one hand, and opinion, judgment, or belief on the other. The need for vigilance to avoid unwittingly crossing the line from supposition to certainty, including by constant repetition of a received wisdom. 841. When assessed intelligence is explicitly and publicly used to support a policy decision, there would be benefit in subjecting that assessment and the underpinning intelligence to subsequent scrutiny by a suitable independent body, such as the Intelligence and Security Committee, with a view to identifying lessons for the future. 842. In the context of the lessons from the preparation of the September 2002 dossier, the inquiry identifies in Section 4.2 the benefits of separating the responsibilities for the assessment of intelligence from the setting out of the arguments in support of a policy. 843. The evidence in Section 4.3 reinforces that lesson, It shows that the intelligence and assessments made by the JIC about Iraq's capabilities and intent continued to be used to prepare briefing material to support government statements in a way which conveyed certainty without acknowledging the limitations of the intelligence. 844. The independence and impartiality of the JIC remains of the utmost importance. 845. As the Foreign Affairs Committee report in July 2003 pointed out, the late Sir Percy Craddock wrote in his history of the JIC that, ideally, intelligence and policy should be close but distinct. Too distinct and the assessments become an ingrowing, self-regarding activity, producing little or no work of interest to the decision makers. Too close a link, and a policy begins to play back on estimates, producing the answers the policy makers would like. The analysts became courtiers, whereas the proper function is to report their findings, without fear or favour. The best arrangement is intelligence and policy in separate but adjoining rooms, with communicating doors and thin partitioned walls. 846. Mr. Straw told the FAC in 2003, "The reason why we have a Joint Intelligence Committee, which is separate from the intelligence agency, is precisely so that those who are obtaining the intelligence are not then directly making the assessment upon it. That is one of the very important strengths of our system, compared with most other systems around the world." 847. The FAC endorsed those sentiments. It stated that the JIC has a vital role in safeguarding the independence and impartiality of intelligence, and that the independence and impartiality of its own role was of the utmost importance. It recommended that ministers should bear in mind at all times the importance that ensuring the JIC is free of all political pressure. 848. In its response, the FAC, the government, stated, "We agree. The JIC plays a crucial role in providing the government with objective assessments on a range of issues of importance to national interests." The invasion of Iraq. 849. The military plan for the invasion of Iraq depended for success on a rapid advance on Baghdad, including convincing the Iraqi population of the coalition's determination to remove the regime. 850. By the end of March, the government had recognized the need for sustained communication of key strategic messages and improved capabilities to reach a range of audiences in the UK, Iraq, and the wider international community. But there was clearly a need for more robust arrangements to integrate coalition efforts in the UK, US, and the forces deployed in Iraq. 851. The reaction of the media and the Iraqi population to perceived difficulties encountered within days of the start of an operation, which was planned to last up to 125 days, might have been anticipated if there had been more rigorous examination of possible scenarios pre-conflict, and the media had better understood the original concept of operations and the nature of the coalition responses to the situations they encountered once the campaign began. 852. The difficulty and complexity of successfully delivering distinct strategic messages to each of the audiences a government needs to reach should not be underestimated. For any future military operations, arrangements tailored to meet the circumstances of each operation need to be put in place in both London and on the ground before operations begin. 853. When the UK acceded to the US request that it assume leadership of a military area of responsibility, encompassing 4 provinces in southern Iraq, it did so without a robust analysis either of the strategic implications for the UK or of the military's capacity to support the UK's potential obligations in the region. 854. A step of such magnitude should be taken deliberately and having considered the wider strategic and resource implications and contingent liabilities. 855. That requires all government departments whose responsibilities will be engaged to have been formally involved in providing ministers with coherent interdepartmental advice before decisions are taken, the proper function of the Cabinet Committee system. The post-conflict period. 856. The UK had not participated in an opposed invasion and full-scale occupation of a sovereign state followed by shared responsibility for security and reconstruction over a long period, since the end of the Second World War. The particular circumstances of Op Telic are unlikely to recur. Nevertheless, there are lessons to be drawn about major operations abroad and the UK's approach to armed intervention. 857. The UK did not achieve its objectives, despite the best efforts and acceptance of risk in a dangerous environment by military and civilian personnel. 858. Although the UK expected to be involved in Iraq for a lengthy period after the conflict, the government was unprepared for the role in which the UK found itself from April 2003. Much of what went wrong stemmed from that lack of preparation. 859. In any undertaking of this kind, certain fundamental elements are of vital importance. The best possible appreciation of the theatre of operations, including the political, cultural and ethnic background and the state of society, the economy and the infrastructure. A hard-headed assessment of risks. Objectives which are realistic within that context, and if necessary, limited, rather than idealistic and based on optimistic assumptions. And allocation of the resources necessary for the task, both military and civil. 860. All of these elements were lacking in the UK's approach to its role in post-conflict Iraq. 861. Where responsibility is to be shared, it is essential to have written agreement in advance on how decision-making and governance will operate within an alliance or a coalition. The UK normally acts with allies, as it did in Iraq. Within the NATO alliance, the rules and mechanisms for decision-making and taking and the sharing of responsibility have been developed over time and are well understood. The coalition in Iraq, by contrast, was an ad hoc alliance. The UK tried to establish some governance principles in the Memorandum of Understanding proposed to the US, but did not press the point. This led to the UK into the uncomfortable and unsatisfactory situation of accepting shared responsibility without the ability to make a formal input to the process of decision-making. 862. As Iraq showed, the pattern set in the initial stage of an intervention is crucial. The maximum impact needs to be made in the early weeks and months, or opportunities missed may be lost forever. It is very difficult to recover from a slow or damaging start. 863. Ground truth is vital. Over-optimistic assessments lead to bad decisions. Senior decision-makers, ministers, chiefs of staff, senior officials must have a flow of accurate and frank reporting. A can-do attitude is laudably ingrained in the UK Armed Forces, a determination to get on with the job however difficult the circumstances. But this can prevent ground truth from reaching senior ears. At times in Iraq, the bearers of bad tidings were not heard. On several occasions, decision-makers visiting Iraq, including the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, and the Chief of the General Staff, found the situation on the ground to be much worse than had been reported to them. Effective audit mechanisms need to be used to counter optimism bias, whether through changes in the culture of reporting, use of multiple channels of information, internal and external, or use of visits. 864. It is important to retain a flexible margin of resources in personnel, equipment and financing, and the ability to change tactics to deal with adverse developments on the ground. In Iraq, that flexibility was lost after the parallel deployment to Helmand Province in Afghanistan, which both constrained the supply of equipment, such as ISTAR, and took away the option of an effective reinforcement. Any decision to deploy to the limit of capabilities entails a high level of risk. In relation to Iraq, the risks involved in the parallel deployment of two enduring medium-scale operations were not examined with sufficient rigour and challenge. 865. The management in Whitehall of a cross-government effort on the scale which was required in Iraq is a complex task. It needs dedicated leadership by someone with time, energy and influence. It cannot realistically be done by a Prime Minister alone, but requires a senior minister with lead responsibility who has access to the Prime Minister and is therefore able to call on his or her influence in resolving problems or conflicts. A coherent interdepartmental effort supported by a structure able to hold departments to account, is required to support such a minister. Reconstruction. 866. The starting point for all discussions of reconstruction in circumstances comparable to those in Iraq between 2003 and 2009 must be that this is an area where progress will be extremely difficult. 867. Better planning and preparation for a post-Saddam Hussein Iraq would not necessarily have prevented the events that unfolded in Iraq between 2003 and 2009. It would not have been possible for the UK to prepare for every eventuality. Better plans and preparation could have mitigated some of the risks to which the UK and Iraq were exposed to between 2003 and 2009, and increased the likelihood of achieving the outcomes desired by the UK and the Iraqi people. 868. From late 2003, successive reviews of the UK's approach to post-conflict reconstruction, later expanded to include the broader concept of stabilisation, resulted in a series of changes to the UK's approach to post-conflict operations. Despite these changes, many of the shortcomings that characterised the UK government's approach to pre-conflict planning and preparation in 2002 and early 2003 persisted after the invasion. 869. The UK government's new strategic framework for stabilisation, the new machinery for interdepartmental coordination, and the enhanced resources now available for stabilisation operations continue to evolve. In future, changes are to increase the effectiveness of UK operations. They must address the lessons for planning, preparation, and implementation derived from the Iraq experience. 870. The lessons identified by the inquiry apply to both the planning and preparation for post-conflict operations, of which reconstruction is a major but not the sole component, and to post-conflict operations themselves. 871. Analysis of the available material must draw on multiple perspectives, reflect dissenting views, identify risk, including that associated with any gaps in knowledge, and consider a range of options. 872. Information must be shared as widely across departments as is necessary to support that approach. 873. Gathering information and analysis of the nature and scale of the potential task should be systematic and as thorough as possible, and should capture the views and aspirations of local communities. 874. Plans derived from that analysis should incorporate a range of options appropriate to different contingencies, reflect a realistic assessment of UK and partners' resources and capabilities, integrate civilian and military objectives and capabilities in support of a single UK strategy, be exposed to scrutiny and challenge at ministerial, senior official and expert level, be reviewed regularly, and if strategic context, risk profile or projected cost changes significantly, be revised. 875. A government must prepare for a range of scenarios, not just the best case, and should not assume that it will be able to improvise. 876. Where the UK is the junior partner and is unable during planning or implementation to secure the outcomes it requires, it should take stock of whether to attach conditions to continued participation and whether further involvement would be consistent with the UK's strategic interest. 877. Public statements on the extent of the UK's ambition should reflect a realistic assessment of what is achievable. To do otherwise is to risk even greater disillusionment and a loss of UK credibility. 878. Departmental priorities and interests will inevitably continue to diverge, even where an interdepartmental body with cross-government role, currently the Stabilisation Unit, is in place. Therefore, cooperation between departments needs continual reinforcement at official and ministerial levels. 879. The head of the Stabilisation Unit, SU, must be sufficiently senior, and the SU enjoy recognition inside and outside government as a centre of excellence in its field if the unit is to have credibility and influence in Number 10, the National Security Council, the Treasury, the FCO, DFID and the MOD, and with the military. Debathification. 880. After the fall of a repressive regime, steps inevitably have to be taken to prevent the closely identified with that regime from continuing to hold positions of influence in public life. The development of plans which minimize undesired consequences, which are administered with justice and which are based on a robust understanding of the social context in which they will be implemented, should be an essential part of preparation for any post-conflict phase. This should include measures designed to address concerns within the wider population, including those of the victims of the old regime, and to promote reconciliation. 881. It is vital to define carefully the scope of such measures. Bringing too many or too few individuals within scope of measures like debathification can have far-reaching consequences for public sector capacity and for the restoration of public trust in the institutions of government. 882. It is also important to think through the administrative implications of the measures to be applied and the process for their implementation. 883. The potential for abuse means that it is essential to have thought through forms of oversight that are as impartial and non-partisan as possible. Security sector reform. 884. An SSR strategy should define the functions of different elements of the relevant security sector and the structures needed to perform those functions. Considering those questions should drive a robust debate about how security requirements might change over time. 885. An understanding of the many different models that exist internationally for internal security, policing, and criminal justice is essential. But those models cannot be considered in isolation, because what works in one country will not necessarily work in another, which may have very different traditions. It is therefore critical for the SSR strategy to take full account of the history, culture, and inherited practices of the country or region in question. The strategy also needs to be informed by the views and aspirations of the local population. 886. A strategy should set out the desired operating standard for each function and state how that differs, if at all, from what exists. In doing so, the strategy should specify where capacity needs to be developed and inform a serious assessment of how the material resources available could best be deployed. 887. It is essential that the UK has an appropriate way to measure the success of any SSR plan. If a clear strategy is in place and has taken account of the views of the local population, the indicators of that success should be obvious. It should rarely concentrate on a one-dimensional set of numbers, but instead be a more qualitative and rounded assessment. Resources. 888. The direction in the Ministerial Code that the estimate of a cost of a proposal should be included in the memorandum submitted to Cabinet or a ministerial committee applies equally to military operations. When evaluating military operations, it is appropriate to consider financial risk alongside other forms of risk. Whilst governments will rarely wish to preclude options solely on the basis of cost, they must also recognise that, over time, cost may become an issue and make it difficult to sustain a military operation over the longer term. 889. Strategies and plans must define the resources required to deliver objectives, identify the budgets that will provide those resources, and confirm that those resources are available. 890. In developing strategies and plans for civilian military operations, a government should address the impact of the different mechanisms used to fund military operations and civil activities, and the extent to which those mechanisms provide perverse incentives for military action, by making it easier to secure funding for agreed military operations than for civilian activities. 891. A government should also address its explicit and implicit financial policy that, while there should be no constraint on the provision of funding for military operations, it is reasonable that for some civilian military operation, departments should find funding for a new civilian activity from within their existing budgets, which are likely to be fully allocated to existing departmental priorities. 892. A government is likely to embark on major civilian military operations such as Iraq only rarely. 893. A government should recognise that in such operations, the civilian components, including diplomatic activity, reconstruction and security sector reform, will be critical for strategic success, may be very substantial, and must be properly resourced. 894. One arrangement would be to create a budget for the civilian components of the operation under the direction of a senior minister with lead responsibility and in support of a coherent UK strategy. Once allocations were made from that budget to individual departments, the allocations would be managed within departments' legal and policy constraints. Such an arrangement should ensure that UK strategy was resourced, promote joint working, minimise the potential for gaming, be able to respond to in-year priorities, and reduce the amount of time that ministers and senior officials need to spend arguing about funding individual activities. 895. The inquiry recognises that, since 2003, significant changes have been made to the UK strategic and operational approach to reconstruction and stabilisation, including to the arrangements for funding such operations. Military equipment, post-conflict. 896. In deciding to undertake concurrent operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, the UK knowingly exceeded the defence planning assumptions. All resources from that point onwards were going to be stretched. Any decision which commits the UK to extended operations in excess of the defence planning assumptions should be based on the most rigorous analysis of its potential implications, including for the availability of relevant capabilities for UK forces. 897. At the start of Op Telig, the MOD knew that it had capability gaps in relation to protected mobility and ISTAR, and that either could have a significant impact on operations. Known gaps in such capabilities should always be clearly communicated to ministers. 898. The MOD should be proactive in seeking to understand and articulate new additional equipment requirements. The MOD told the inquiry that there was no simple answer to the question of where the primary responsibility for identifying capability gaps lay during Op Telig. That is unacceptable. The roles and responsibilities for identifying and articulating capability gaps in enduring operations must be clearly defined, communicated, and understood by those concerned. It is possible that this has been addressed after the period covered by this inquiry. 899. Those responsible for making decisions on the investment of military capabilities should continually evaluate whether the balance between the current operational requirements and long-term defence programs is right, particularly to meet an evolving threat on current operations. 900. During the first 4 years of Op Telig, there was no clear statement of policy setting out the acceptable level of risk to UK forces, and who was responsible for managing that risk. The MOD had suggested to the inquiry that successive policies defining risk ownership and governance more clearly have addressed that absence, and the wider MOD risk management processes have also been revised. In any future operation, the level of force protection required to meet the assessed threat needs to be addressed explicitly. Civilian personnel, 901. The inquiry recognises that, since 2003, significant changes have been made to the UK strategic and operational approach to reconstruction and stabilisation. Some of those changes, including the establishment of a deployable UK civilian standby capability, are the direct result of lessons learned from serious shortcomings in the deployment of civilian personnel in post-conflict Iraq. 902. The effectiveness of UK civilian effort in post-conflict Iraq was compromised by a range of factors, including the absence of effective cross-government coordination on risk, duty of care and the terms and conditions applicable to personnel serving in Iraq. 903. The difficult working conditions for civilians in Iraq were reflected in short tour lengths and frequent leave breaks. Different departments adopted different arrangements throughout the Iraq campaign, leading to concerns about breaks in continuity, loss of momentum, lack of institutional memory and insufficient local knowledge. 904. Different departments will continue to deploy civilian staff in different roles. Standardisation of all aspects of these deployments may not be appropriate, but greater harmonisation of departmental policies should be considered wherever possible. The same approach should be applied to locally engaged LE staff. 905. At all stages, including planning, departments must give full consideration to their responsibilities and duty of care towards LE staff, who have an essential contribution to make and will face particular risks in insecure environments. 906. All civilian deployments should be assessed and reviewed against a single rigorous cross-government framework for risk management. The framework should provide the means for the government as a whole to strike an effective balance between security and operational effectiveness, and to take timely decisions on the provision of appropriate security measures. 907. Standardizing tour lengths for civilians deployed by different departments would have eased the overall administrative burden and, perhaps, some of the tensions between the individuals from different government departments serving in Iraq. But the environment was difficult, and individuals' resilience and circumstances varied. The introduction of the option to extend a tour of duty was an appropriate response. 908. Throughout any operation of this kind, departments should maintain two procedures for the systematic debriefing of staff returning to the UK. One to meet the duty of care obligations, the other to learn lessons from their experience. 909. In order to identify individuals with the right skills, there must be clarity about the roles they are to perform. Whenever possible, individuals should be recruited for and deployed to clearly defined roles appropriate to their skills and seniority. They must be provided with the equipment needed to perform those roles to a high standard. 910. The government should consider the introduction of a mechanism for responding to a surge in demand for a particular language capability. 911. The inquiry views the inability of the FCO, the MOD, and DFID to confirm how many civilian personnel were deployed or employed in Iraq, in which locations and in what roles, as a serious failure. Data management systems must provide accurate information on the names, roles, and locations of all staff for whom departments have duty of care responsibilities.